Welcome to Nailing It Down, and today we are talking about J.A. Hobson, or John Atkins Hopkins, or John A. Hopkins. You will see his name printed as all of the above. We are going to go into the period of early socialism and late classical liberalism, where the line between the two is actually quite thin. And we're going to talk about the origins of anti-imperialist theory, as well as their relationship to economic theories. This is a question, or a series of questions, that's come up over and over again. Anti-imperialism is a complicated topic, partly because it does not merely mean, actually from J.A. Hobson forward, the nationalistic conquering of other nations for their own sake. Anti-imperialism as a concept in the English-speaking world really actually started taking off in America before Britain. Now, the reasons for this are somewhat complicated, but the phrase is most associated with the American Anti-Imperialist League, which begins around the time of the Spanish-American War and was an extension of anti-expansionist politics going back to the Mexican-American War in the United States. Now, this might be considered by many people historically ironic, given that the entire colonial project that it created New World nations in the first place under European colonial rule, and then later as independent settler colonial projects, were inherently imperialist. This is also where the contradictions of liberal thought really begins to manifest in a way that was undeniable to liberal intellectuals. However, Hobson was not part of this movement. In fact, he was removed from the UK context. His involvement in anti-imperialism began when he covered the Second Boer War as a correspondent for the Manchester Guardian. Now, we'll come back to those commentaries because they will be brought up later. Like many of the American anti-imperialists, he opposed the development of monopolies. This would also be picked up by the American progressive movement. He saw monopolies as consolidating power in a way that had a disproportionate influence over the government and the general society, but also, and somewhat uniquely for his time, continued the classical economic analysis about profit rates declining. While Hobson was definitely influenced by socialists, such as the Christian socialists around H.M. Heidemann, the early social democrats in Britain, and he was also exposed to Henry George's single taxation system on land. And he even later befriended a few prominent early Fabians. There is almost no mention of Marx and Marxist economics in his writing. Instead, working off of classical economics of the time, he and his major early collaborator, Alfred F. Mummery, began focusing on consumption patterns and a critique of Say's law. In 1889, Mummery and Hobson wrote a book called The Physiology of Industry, which stated that under consumption as the primary problem of capital leading to declining profits. he also, in many ways, was a forerunner of marginal productivity theory of distribution. So you have a man whose background is largely in economics and who works as a war correspondent. Profoundly affected by the Boer War, he believed that the mine owners, primarily led by Cecil Rhodes, wanted control of Transvaal to expand their declining profit rates and to accumulate more raw capital. He wrote several works around this, one called The Psychology of Jingoism, another called The War in South Africa. And then finally, Imperialism in 1902. And these works were all written very quickly, actually. The War in South Africa came out in 1900, The Psychology of Jingoism in 1901, and Imperialism in 1902. And what made imperialism unique as an analysis was that he believed that it was not nationalistic pride or even pure geopolitics that led to imperialist expansion. He believed in the fact that a capitalist oligarchy had developed from the centralization of profits, that said centralization had led to declining rates of profits, that the only way to get out of this bind was to seek foreign sources of profits, and this could not be done under the guise of economics, but needed to be done under the guise of moral betterment, the expansion of territory, and Christianization. And so you see here another trend that you would later see in Marxist writings, where cultural reasons are epiphenomenal to economic ones. Now, again, we need to emphasize, however, that while Hobson was critiquing classical theory of rents, he was critiquing Say's law. He was influenced by early social democrats and Christian socialists. He is working within the British tradition of classical political economy. He is largely exiled from formal economics for his positions on Say's law, actually. So he, does not get to work in economics as a field. He's sort of politically excluded from it, which is why he ends up doing so much journalistic work and writing so many books. Now, Hobson's theory is different from Nikolai Bukharin and Vladimir Lenin's use of his theories. In fact, Lenin name checks him directly, but to talk about how Karl Kautsky's theory of ultra-imperialism was really kind of a watered-down version of Hobson's inter-imperialist cooperation thesis. Bukharin pulls strongly from Hobson and combines Hobson's theories with explicit Marxist theories about the development of monopoly capital. And Bukharin's theories become refined and popularized by Lenin's imperialism, the highest phase of capitalism. Now, what makes Hobson different from Bukharin and Lenin is that he thought under consumptionism, a theory that actually is developed concurrently in Rosa Luxemburg, but for communist societies, was the answer to a misdistribution of wealth in capitalist society. So we already see here something actually kind of like modern Keynesian influence social democracy. He did not think this was not capitalism, though. In fact, he explicitly states this, that capitalism was thus for him an earlier and separate phase from imperialism, and that imperialism was a separate thing. And again, Bukharin and Lenin would reject this and see imperialism as a necessary development of capital and just an extension of it in the realm of geopolitics, as opposed to within one national polity. Whereas Hobson thinks that profits can be maintained by redistribution of those profits so that consumption can be maintained and the profit margin never approaches zero. This is actually also influential on isolationist theories in America of how to run the economy. It is not an accident that Fordism in Henry Ford was also tied to the isolationist schools of American politics. Now, we can talk about whether we should call that isolationist. It kind of really wasn't isolationist in any real sense, geopolitically. But this idea of American development for the states with redistribution of wealth downwards, either by the state anti-taxation policy or through the specific management of factories, again, Fordism, is actually also an extension of the imperialist critique. So you have both social democratic answers and, frankly, paleo-conservative answers in the American context, pulling from J.A. Hobson. So Hobson is undeniably influential because he gives a coherent economic thesis to why imperialism happens. Now, we should not mistake Hobson for an anti-racist. He was not. Indeed, while he thought imperialism was immoral in all cases, that certain races would be eliminated by economic development. While he was majorly influential on the British Liberal Party's critique of imperialism, he did not join it, and indeed, after opposing entry into World War I, joins the Independent Labour Party, and thus becomes a reformist socialist towards the end of his life. So he does enter the socialist milieu, which, frankly, many people in the left wing of classical liberalism do. Now, mentioning his stances on race, he doesn't write a lot on race, but he does seem to think that a lot of races will be eliminated in economic development. He also seems to have had like most 19th century people, a positive view of the eugenics movement, although it doesn't come up much in his writings. He also believed that Jewish finance capital was a major threat to the war. He attributed that to the negative influences on Cecil Rhodes, also blaming the Rothschilds. And he has been critiqued for being overly economically reductionist and also anti-Semitic. A charge that in his early writings seems true, and anti-imperialism is only referenced obliquely. So, that is the theory. And to recap really fast, Hobson's theory is that monopolies develop because of the concentration of wealth, that this leads to a declining rates of profit, that to fix this, the oligarchs push political policy that is expansionist to open up foreign markets, to find new sources of profitability, they can do this because of their social powers as oligarchs through monopolization. The answers to this, according to Hobson, are redistribution of the surplus profits across the nation, which would create an internal market that would, through redistribution, create enough constant profits through consumption to lead to a profitable capitalist state. Now, you'll notice this doesn't sound like capitalism. It's actually, you know, in the way we use it now, it sounds a lot like what Americans have classically accused of being socialism. And it does rhyme with the underconsumptionist theories of Rosa Luxemburg. But it is, you know, Hobson is a reformist socialist. He does not view himself as a socialist until the late 19-teens, 1920, around there, around the beginning of and end of World War I. Okay, so that is the history and background of J. Hobson, the first major theorist of the economic origins of anti-imperialism. And as I mentioned, he has had influences on American paleoconservatism, British liberalism, as well as, and most explicitly, early Marxist theories of anti-imperialism. And we will end this nailing it down here. Upcoming, I'm going to talk about something I mentioned in the beginning, which is American anti-imperialism in the Anti-Imperial League. The first one, not the later one under the Comintern, which was, you know, something that Hobson was in dialogue with. And with that, we're going to wrap it up today. I would like to thank my patrons who asked many questions about imperialism, which is going to lead to this series, as well as the patron and sponsor, Ivan Ivanovich, who has specifically commissioned me to do a series on anti-imperialism in English-speaking countries and their history. All right. Thank you, Ivan. Thank you, other patrons. And thank you all for watching. Have a great day and continue nailing it down.